Hello from me, Lazar Hristov. We continue with the next lesson of the CSS course. Last time we started with 6th chapter, Box Model and Indentation of Elements. And we have reached to the following point 25.3.3. The border radius property. This property is new, introduced in CSS 3. As mentioned before, this property allows you to round the corners of the HTML elements frame. This rounding can be specified by 1 or 2 radius values, defining its shape. A single value defines the shape of a circle. Here's an example: 20 pixels, and 2 values separated by a slash, define an ellipse shape. Here's an example with 2 values, 30 px for the first and 20 px for the second. The border radius property is a shorthand variant like the font or border properties, which we've already looked at, for creating the radius of the 4 corners of the frame. Otherwise, the radius of each corner can be set separately, using these properties: border top left radius, border top right radius, border bottom left radius, border bottom right radius. The border radius property can be set for a different number of corners. Its syntax is as follows: 1 value applies to all 4 corners, 2 values apply to the corners along the first value is for upper left and lower right, and the second for upper right and lower left. Three values are set like this, and 4 values are set like this. The border radius property is not only executed when the element has a border set, but also when only a background is set. We'll show this in the next example, which will contain 3 paragraphs. The last one will be without a border. The code is as follows. And here's what we'll see in the browser. Here you see what way it rounds off, and you see that works in this case too. For using border radius in older browsers, you can use prefixes that are written in the following way: WebKit border radius, for Chrome and Safari. Moz border radius, for Mozilla Firefox. O border radius, for Opera. And finally, I will say that this property can be defined as very successful, revolutionary, because before, this was done in a very complicated way, through various images that were embedded here, and it was generally a big toy and work for developers. And we can say that this feature made developers' lives easier. So, we move on to a very interesting topic: width and height of blocks, the box sizing property. Box sizing is an extremely important feature that actually rediscovers hot water, but sometimes it happens. I'll start this topic by asking you one question. In your opinion, how is the most logical to set and calculate the width and height of blocks in HTML? For me personally, for example, when I realized that each block element consists of content, padding and border, I thought that its dimensions were set and calculated relative to its outermost part, naturally. In my opinion, this is absolutely logical and natural, or, that in extreme cases it is calculated to the frame, for example, because let's say the outer indent sometimes it can be ignored, as with margin collapse. Here's the thing, for clarity. I'm applying the block model scheme again. We have content, we have inner padding, we have a border, we have outer padding. I thought it was most logical to calculate it this way to calculate it. That's how I imagined it, for example, as a box with a gift in it, and respectively the gift is the content, the inner padding is the distance to the box is the frame, and the outer padding is the distance to the neighboring boxes. And logically, in this way, the dimensions of the box should correspond to the dimensions of the frame. Yes, that's how it seemed to me then, but the reality turned out to be different. According to the specifications and standards of the W3C consortium, the width and height of a block are determined only by the content, without including anything else. That is, to calculate the actual size of the block, the internal indent and the border must be added. This approach is also adopted by the developers of most browsers, with the exception of Internet Explorer versions 4 and 5, according to which it is more appropriate to include the width and height, the content plus the outer margin plus the frame, as I imagined it, and which is much more reasonable and logical. Here is the difference schematically, and you can see what a deviation this gives in reality. So, this discrepancy created a big problem at the time, because at that time Internet Explorer was the most widely used browser, and you couldn't make a quality website without taking into account the developer with how the site will look in Internet Explorer. That is, this required developers to make additional hacks so that the site could display correctly in Internet Explorer, and all of this created a negative attitude towards this browser. However, over the years, it finally dawned on me that Internet Explorer 4 and 5 were right, and that their way was in many cases more efficient and better. Because when the dimensions don't include the padding and the border, and you have to calculate the total width, it gets very complicated, especially when we have dimensions given in percentages, and a border or padding given pixels. And all this is put on the developer's head. That's why in the new version of CSS 3 they finally understood this and gave the possibility to choose the way in which the width of the block can be calculated. And this is implemented through the property box sizing and its value border box. The most important values that box sizing can take are, content box, this is the default value, that is, when box sizing is not set, this value is assumed. It calculates the dimensions in the old way, and I just couldn't understand why this is the default value. Since the border box value is much more important and it should be the default. But this is still a decision of the W3C consortium, in my opinion incorrect. After all, border box, this is the value, which is key and important, which carries the meaning, and for the sake of which this property is actually introduced. So that it's like the developers of Internet Explorer 4 and 5. And they need to rehabilitate these people, and apologize to them for neglecting and blaming them for so many years. Box sizing, border box is actually the value at which the dimensions are calculated according to the box model of the developers of Internet Explorer 4 and 5, that is, as the sum of the content dimensions plus the padding plus the border. Thus the width is equal to the content plus the padding plus the border, and the height is equal to the content plus the padding plus the border. And from here we get back to what I already said, that the border box value is actually the point of introducing box sizing. So, to make box sizing work on older browsers, you can use prefixes, in the same way as I already showed. Here, let's look at an example, to just see what the difference is. In the first case we will use the W3C method, and in the second case Internet Explorer. Here is the code, here is what we will see. We see that the first block is wider than the second by 60 pixels. This is the difference between using both methods. To see how the outer indentation works margin, we will set the distance between the two blocks to 20 pixels. And to make it clearer we will do it like this, and this is what we see as the final result in this example. That's all for this lesson. Best regards.